Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Hitali Ladaya. I am on the Symposium team, and I just really want to say thank you to everyone for joining us for these really important conversations today. Welcome to Revitalization Today, Urban Renewal and Eminent Domain. I'm going to take a moment to briefly introduce each of our speakers. I'll kick us off with a handful of questions, but as with all of our other panels today, we would really love for you to ask questions as well. There's a real diversity of perspectives on this panel here, and so I hope you'll take advantage of that. And you've probably noticed that some of our panels today have been more about Detroit or more about comparative perspectives, and I really think this one is a blend. There's people here that are very much experts on our local issues, and there's people here who are very much experts on their local issues, which are elsewhere. So something to keep in mind. Just kind of going on down the line, we have first Amina Kirk. She's the Senior Legal and Policy Advocate and Organizer at Detroit People's Platform. In this role, she specializes in affordable housing and equitable development, including working with the Equitable Detroit Coalition, Housing Trust Fund Coalition, and the Coalition to Stop Unconstitutional Tax Foreclosures, which has been mentioned a handful of times today. Next, we have Olga Palmar. She's a lawyer who's worked in legal services in New Jersey for over 3 decades, representing low-income persons and community groups in regard to various housing and neighborhood issues, including landlord-tenant disputes, preservation of affordable housing, eminent domain and redevelopment, civil rights, and environmental justice. We have Council Member Castañeda-López. She is a social worker and a graduate of this university, and a member of Detroit City Council. She represents District 6 with over 10 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. We have Professor Ilya Somin, Professor of Law at George Mason University, and the author of several books, including Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, and The Grasping Hand, Kelo versus City of New London, and the Limits of Eminent Domain. And lastly, but not least, Sean White, who's the Director of Fund Development at Develop Detroit. So in that role, he helps lead efforts to attract capital that enables Develop Detroit to execute on its mission of preserving affordable housing and revitalizing neighborhoods. So those are our voices, and I'd love to start you all out with a question that has 2 parts. First, how does renewal impact people in cities like Detroit or the communities you're from, for better or for worse? And what are the major legal tools that are employed in renewal efforts, keeping in mind that even the word renewal is not necessarily neutral or agreed upon in terms of what it means. So if it means something in particular to you, please feel free to tell us.
Hello. So I work for a racial and economic justice nonprofit, and so I work a lot specifically in affordable housing and economic development. For us, Detroit's revitalization has represented a lot of extraction and shifting of power, and not as much prosperity as we see in the media for the citizens that actually live in the city and have been in the city for a long time. When it comes to things that we heard about this morning, such as emergency management, such as the foreclosure crisis and the foreclosure system, we see a lot of systems that have been used in Detroit to remove land and to remove democratic power and to remove money from communities that have been there a really long time and place them in the hands of newcomers or very wealthy people that have been in the city for some time. It happens on a continuous basis. We have a million examples of it. You've heard about some already. We have a current battle that's going on with the Fiat Chrysler plant, where there's a huge expansion of a plant in the city happening, and basically eminent domain playing out. Very similar to the way it has historically, but also some new iterations. In order to get this plant created, there was a lot of work and effort and energy and time put into securing the property that the corporation needed, and that took the form of giving a lot of public land away to that corporation and a lot of public money. That same thing happened with the Ford headquarters development, which is Central Station, and the same thing happened with the creation of the Olympia Development Arena, the new hockey arena. it happens over and over where public land, public money are used to enrich corporations, are used to enrich powerful individuals in the city. And when you control the land, you control the policy. And so we see that happen where the law and the way the laws work and the way the laws structure, even on the state level, are being altered to fit the needs of these corporations and these power holders in Southeast Michigan, in Detroit, in the state. And so that's what we fight against by organizing residents to hold on to the power they have, reclaim the power that's being taken, prevent the displacement of land that is happening and the displacement of financing of public money. One thing that doesn't get spoken about a lot, we know that the land gets lost and we know that the public money goes away, is the deterioration of community. We heard about that in the panel we were just in, what it means to lose not just your home, but to lose your schools, to lose the fabric of your social sphere that has been existent for a long time. Also the loss of the commons. So we see in Detroit that things that are part of the commons, that are part of a healthy, vibrant community, parks, libraries, communal spaces that people can use for free, community centers, are becoming privatized. And we see that corporations will start to fund them, and that is often celebrated. But the problem is when corporations fund them and when it's a public-private partnership, there are restrictions that the corporations are allowed to place on how those spaces are used. They can become political. They can become restrictive of political conversations, of political action in those spaces. And it's not a good model to turn over what we do have in our commons over to private hands, because there are always strings attached. And so we see that happen a lot in Detroit. So renewal for us has not been as positive as it could be. And that's why we continue to fight. We sometimes are cast as pessimists, but the reason we're fighting is because we know that it could be done more effectively and more equitably. We fight for community benefits. We do not fight against development. We fight against inequitable development, and that we would like to see community benefits attached to these large deals. We think it's the perfect opportunity to revitalize our commons and keep them public. We think it's the perfect opportunity to fund affordable housing, to fund schools, to fund the things that we haven't had money for decades. Now that we have this major development happening, we need to capitalize on that for the public, rather than operating from a mentality of scarcity, in that we must let the corporations do whatever they want to do, lest they leave and we go back to a state of disinvestment.
Thank you.
So working at Legal Services, I represent low-income homeowners, low-income tenants, and low-income community groups in a very diverse area. I mean, I work in southern New Jersey, and people may think of New Jersey as a tiny little state, and it is, but it's very diverse. Our service area covers the Pine Barren woodlands, it covers farm country, it covers little towns, and it covers some urban areas. And we've seen, well, I hate those terms revitalization and renewal, because what it always makes me feel is that people think it's success when they get rid of my clients. That's what they consider successful urban development. And I've actually seen numerous articles and press and media reports that say that. We got rid of public housing. We got rid of the slum. And it's almost like, if a urban planner can somehow make this issue of poverty and decrepit housing and stuff, if they can just make it invisible, go away, and become someone else's problem, they've somehow succeeded. So unfortunately, that's what I see urban renewal often referring to, and other speakers have said it so much more eloquently than I can, but everything that's been said previously about how these communities have real assets. They have local leadership. They have services and businesses and community institutions that serve that client population. They have friends and neighbors and extended families living close to each other. And all those things are lost when people are forcibly displaced. So to kind of go back to your question, how do we see this happening? Well, probably the most I think the most drastic, the most cruel form is a massive redevelopment with use of eminent domain. You know, I kind of thought from studying land use policies that that whole thing that people call Negro removal of the 60s and 70s, when huge African-American neighborhoods got destroyed and replaced with high-rise public housing, it seemed like we should have learned our lessons from that, but we saw a huge wave of it in the, like around between 2000 and 2005, 2006, when the housing market was really inflated bubble. We saw a huge revival of use of eminent domain and massive redevelopment projects. Camden, which is where I'm based, is a city of 80,000. You know, every neighborhood is unique, but the similarities between Camden and Detroit have really been hitting me really hard as I've been listening to the stories about Detroit, because Camden has a poverty rate of about 40%. Only about 5% of its population is non-Hispanic white, and it's everybody's poster child of blight. You know, the highest crime rates, the highest dropout rates, the highest lead poisoning rates. I mean, all the statistical competitions, Camden can win them. And so at one time, there was a state takeover with a very drastic kind of dictatorship imposed by the state because the city was so distressed. And they proposed putting the entire city in a redevelopment zone so that they would have the right of eminent domain over every single piece of property in Camden. And then they proceeded to figure out which developers they wanted to give which parcel of land to. At one point, there were 2,200 housing units, including both apartments and homes, that were on a list to be acquired as part of this redevelopment, and that was just what they said they were going to acquire. They would have the legal right to acquire it. So a lot of litigation ensued. We had 4 cases out of Camden. Eventually, these plans were scaled back or beaten back through a variety of forces. Let me repeat what other speakers have said. Legal strategies alone don't work. They only work when there's active community involvement, community organizing, and a desire to change the political will. But eminent domain is a cruel process. People get what's supposed to be the market value of an undervalued home in a depressed area. They get a pathetic amount of relocation assistance, and they basically are likely never to be a homeowner again. So we also see more subtle forms of displacement, more subtle ways to push people out. You know, there is code enforcement, oppressive code enforcement, where you kick people out for overcrowding, or you condemn properties as uninhabitable for things that could be fixed. You know, we represent a lot of tenants, and I know there's a lot of discussion here about homeowners, but tenants are a very important part of a community as well, and there are many tenants who are very active members and leaders in their neighborhoods and who also have a vested interest in keeping their home. We see a lot of pressures on affordable housing. Public housing, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is being quote-unquote repositioned. That's the word HUD uses these days. Basically, public housing is dying. It's an institution. It's not going to be around with us much longer. That means that all our subsidized housing is going to be owned and operated by private developers. There's a lot of threats to that housing, particularly if there's a hot housing market, because developers can get out of contracts or deed restrictions to keep housing affordable for the long term in a variety of ways, depending on which program they're in. And of course, there's rising housing costs, and there is a general feeling of longtime residents no longer being made to feel welcome, no longer feeling like it's their community. So each town is unique and it has its own dynamics, but all those things come into play to threaten the viability of long-term established low-income communities of color.
I don't know if this is breaking rules, but if I can make it interactive, that would be great. I would ask you guys to close your eyes for like 5 seconds. And when you think of the term renewal, what images come to your mind? What does that feel like? What does that look like to be in that space? And you can open your eyes after you've thought of that. And I'm just curious, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Just feel free to shout it out. What does renewal look like and feel like? Okay, he's from Detroit and he's an activist, so he knows. Okay, Dan Gilbert and a puff of smoke. Okay, other people, if you just think of renewal, like what is that? I don't know. And what do you think? Anybody else? You don't have to raise your hands. It's okay. You can just. Okay, a very specific. Okay, we have some cynical people here. Okay, anybody else?
I feel like it's a house redo.
Okay.
What is it when we take walls fresh and we let more light in and feel more bright and cheery and cozy?
Yeah, in general, when people think of renewal, it's something positive, something that we want to work towards, right? It's something that's like brings light and like a new beginning. So I want you to close your eyes again, and this time for 10 seconds, and think of when I say the word poverty, what does that look like, and what does that feel like? What does that sound like? I would even ask that. Okay, open your eyes. Anybody, what does poverty look like? What does it sound like? What does that feel like? Tarps on roof, porches that are decayed. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Does that feel good, like something you're working towards? No. Okay. I think it's important because I think before you even get to the conversation about some of the legal nitty-gritty about different specific renewal projects or what that means for folks is to really think of what our initial instinct reaction is to those terms. Oftentimes when we talk about renewal, it's in places of poverty. That we're even University of Michigan, I love you, I'm an alum, but we have a poverty solutions program. And as somebody who grew up in poverty, and I think there's an image that comes to mind when we say that word poverty, of loud places, of dirty places, and of the people that live in those places. And so there's this constant kind of underlying assumption of wanting to change and move people out of that because it doesn't feel good, it doesn't look good, it makes us feel uncomfortable. And usually those people we think of are people who are uneducated. They tend to be people of color. Oftentimes they're women with multiple children. So I don't like to use the term poverty because I think automatically there's a stigma that comes to it. And when you talk about renewal, it's the same type of thing that comes to mind. But you can't have a conversation about one without having a conversation about the other. So thank you for engaging that brief interactive activity with me. The other piece I just want to highlight when we talk about renewal, to take it back before the 60s, I guess even before slavery, when we think of colonization of this country, and I studied Native American studies, and I was trying to remember what the act was passed in the late 1800s. It was the Dawes Act of 1887. And essentially it was an act that was passed that removed land from Native people and kind of destroy the more communal sense of having land tenured for these communities and impose this more individualistic sense of ownership onto people. And there was a process that the government had. So you had to be deemed to be Indian enough to be able to keep land, but also civilized enough to be able to maintain your land. Because if you were viewed as not being capable of maintaining your land, then it was then held in a government trust. Now those conversations, although they may happen centuries ago, are very familiar and very similar to conversations we have today about home ownership, who's qualified and deserving of being a homeowner, who can benefit from the renewal in our cities, and who has the skill set and the responsibility and a commitment to be able to be in these spaces that we're creating. And I think it's important to think of that larger historical context of it and how essentially it's ingrained into our fabric of a nation of how we deal with land disposition as a country, and it's not an issue specific to the city of Detroit. So when I think of renewal in the city of Detroit, the question is always for who, right? And who are you trying to erase? And as I think the resident poverty council person, my staff member's here, she could say I always talk about it. Shout out to my staff person, Nicole Vargas, who's an alum of the University of Michigan Law Program. So we oftentimes talk about like wanting to reduce poverty to then renew these communities and restore hope. But I don't think you can, those are often in conflict for me. I don't think you can do that in a way, because the conversation can't be about fixing these people or fixing the neighborhoods they live in when that's not really the problem. The larger problem is about inequities and barriers that exist to give people access to the economic opportunities that they're denied. So like if I always say this, if I made like $25,000, but I had access to healthcare, I had like a local grocery store and a school and a church and a park that I could go to that was like safe and didn't have broken sidewalks. If I didn't have to worry about, you know, a crazy water bill or taxes, I could probably be okay on $25,000 a year. Unfortunately, I have like X amount of money in student loans. I maintain all of my family, which 7+ members. That's often common in communities of color, of people, generational poverty, trying to, you know, move beyond that. I am lucky that I live in a neighborhood that has parks and grocery stores, but not necessarily the same for everybody. So for me, it really is a flawed focus in terms of the conversation about renewing communities. and getting people's jobs and access to education. I mean, I think that's important, but the focus really needs to be about how do we remove the barriers that systemically deny people being able to participate in the existing economic opportunities. And that really has to be the focus. So it's not a conversation of renewal and reduction of poverty. It's about economic opportunities and economic justice, and how do we, I think, really fundamentally shift the paradigm and the systems that we continue to perpetuate that disproportionately remove land, water, and other resources from minority and marginalized communities. And I will just say, in terms of like legal tools to do that, I think on the city council, right, obviously it's legislation that we can be introducing and working to modify, but I think the other piece is just some of the structures. Like, I think of zoning all the time, and if people knew more and understood zoning and what can go in their neighborhoods and what can't go in their neighborhoods and how to modify the zoning process, that's a really, really powerful tool that we often talk about rezoning places so they can be special districts, so then they can have like mixed use development, and not really thinking about the longer term consequences of rezoning those spaces to support that type of development. So that's one I would love to hear more conversation about, and maybe that doesn't seem like a direct legal tool that impacts housing, but from what I've seen in the city of Detroit, it definitely has a longer term implication on communities and who's able to stay in those neighborhoods. And then I think the other piece is, I think sometimes in terms of the legal tools and information that exists, there's some disconnect, right? Like, I'm on council, and I was given a wonderful binder of like 5 articles to read before I came on the panel. Sorry guys, I did not read all those articles before I came today. There's like a wealth of knowledge within academia, which doesn't necessarily always translate to the actual people implementing the policy. And then there's a disconnect, I think, on the community side. So for me, really thinking about systemic change, it's you have to have the community organizing, you have to have the policies that will promote justice, and you have to have the elected officials in office. And so often we either focus on the policies or we focus on the organizing, and we don't necessarily have those elected officials, or you have the policies but they don't translate to the community, or they don't translate to elected officials, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have all key pieces of the triangle, then you really aren't going to see the type of change that we need to ensure that the most marginalized, and when I think of organizing, it's the people who are on the fringes, not the privileged, all of us that are in this space, but the people who have the greatest number of needs, and then organizing oftentimes when we think of these solutions, we think of like who's at the center, who we see, who come to places, the middle class, and not the people who aren't present there. And they have fewer needs than the folks that are out here. So again, it needs to really be a paradigm shift in terms of how we approach legislation and some of these solutions to think of the fringes and organizing. So, thank you.
So as I think you've already seen, urban renewal is a term that means many different things to different people. I'm going to focus on 2 aspects that are related to my research on this subject: eminent domain and zoning. These topics are usually discussed separately, but in truth they're linked, because with eminent domain, what you often see is people expelled from their communities, losing opportunities in that way. Zoning is almost the flip side of the same coin. Through restrictive zoning, often many millions of people are prevented from entering desirable communities in the first place. So I think both of these pieces of the puzzle need to be considered if we're going to have a good overall picture. So I'll start with eminent domain. Almost since the start of the Republic, actually, we've had a debate about eminent domain. In the Fifth Amendment to the federal Constitution, and also in almost every state constitution, we have a provision saying that the government can only take property for a public use. And from early on, there was a debate between people who said a public use has to be a public project in a relatively narrow sense of the word, like a public road, or at least a public utility, which has an obligation to serve the entire public, versus other people who argued for a broader conception and said a public use can be almost anything the government says it is, so long as it potentially benefits the public in some way, even if the land, when it's condemned, is transferred to some sort of private owner or interest. In the 19th century, in most places, the narrower conception of public use predominated, and the use of eminent domain, for the most part, was relatively strictly limited. But in the 20th century, both legal opinion and elite opinion and public opinion shifted on this, and the broader conception won out, and it actually won out in large part because of the movement for urban renewal. In 1954, in a case called Berman versus Parker, which I think is one of the most important Supreme Court cases that even most constitutional law professors have never heard of, but it decided that a public use is pretty much anything that the government says that it is, and it did so in the context of an urban renewal condemnation to eliminate blight in Washington, D.C., which actually that project expelled some 3,000 African Americans from a poor neighborhood. And this was part of a much larger urban renewal movement, which condemned properties that were seen as slums or blighted or other similar terms for the purpose of transforming them supposedly into better places that would be more productive and happier. The metaphor that was often used, you see this even occasionally today, is a kind of medical metaphor that just as a surgeon has to cut out diseased ulcerous tissue or something like that from the body, so we have to cut out diseased neighborhoods from the body of a city in order to create a healthier environment in the city. In effect, it's almost analogizing people to diseases, or at least neighborhoods to diseases. And in the process of this, from the 1930s through the 1970s, in these urban renewal and blight takings, we forcibly displaced probably as many as several million people, mostly from large and medium-sized cities, and the overwhelming majority of them were actually racial minorities. This is why James Baldwin famously labeled urban renewal as Negro removal. Originally, this was supposed to be limited to areas which really were blighted in a narrow sense of the word, but over time, in many states, the definition of blight became so broad that almost any area could be declared blighted and condemned. And some jurisdictions even just said you can condemn property and transfer it to another private individual just to promote quote-unquote economic development. It doesn't have to be blighted or dilapidated in some way, just the government can just say, we have a project that we want to do here, we'll transfer it to somebody else and condemn for that purpose. Those kinds of projects and condemnations also forcibly displaced large numbers of people. And both blight and economic development takings do continue on some significant scale even today, though they have been cut back. Here in Detroit actually has been a major center for both. Obviously in the 50s and 60s, there was massive displacement through urban renewal takings. In 1981, also in Detroit, we had the Poletown case, about which I wrote my first academic article about eminent domain, which forcibly displaced some 4,000 people so that the land could be transferred to General Motors to build a new factory, which as it turned out didn't produce anywhere near as much jobs or as many cars actually either as there was expected to produce. So as in the Poletown case and many of these other situations, not only were large numbers of people victimized and thrown into worse situations than before, but also probably this process destroyed more economic development than it created. One of the lessons of modern development economics is that secure property rights are really important to successful development. They're what incentivize people to invest, to form ties to their community and so forth. And obviously this kind of large-scale use of eminent domain tends to undermine that. In 2005, in the Kilo case, about which I wrote a book called The Grasping Hand, the Supreme Court decided that it actually upheld even pure economic development takings under the federal constitution in a narrow 5-4 decision. This case generated an enormous backlash. 45 states enacted reform laws, including the state of Michigan. Those reforms are very much a mixed bag, but there has been some real progress, including in Michigan, but there's much more still to do in terms of reforming both blight takings and economic development takings. I would actually just ban both kinds of condemnations completely, but even if you don't want to go as far as I would, I think there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. The zoning story is in some ways similar, that beginning in the early 20th century, various local and state governments began to impose much tighter restrictions on what land could be used for. And as with eminent domain, it was often used to exclude the poor and minorities and the like by having restrictions such as allowing only single-family housing in a particular area, requiring neighborhoods to be purely residential with no commercial uses, and a large number of other things like that, which artificially reduce the amount of housing and also the amount of commercial opportunities as well that could exist in various neighborhoods. In some cases, the motivation was explicitly racial or ethnic. In other cases, it was class-based, and still others, yes, they genuinely believed, I think, that this would be better for everybody. But the upshot of several waves of restrictive zoning is that in many large cities, particularly on the East and West Coast, the amount of housing has been severely restricted, and the price has been increased by as much as 50 or 100% in many places, which prices out many millions of people from areas where they could otherwise find housing and opportunity. The minority poor are severely affected by this, but so too also the white working class, whose troubles we heard a lot about in the 2016 election, that economists estimate that if in areas where we have the most restrictive zoning, if those big cities were to reduce their level of zoning to just the average level, not even to zero, but to the average level prevailing in a nation as a whole, that could increase US GDP by 9 or 10%, provide millions of people with opportunities and jobs, and probably bolster the fortunes of the poor, perhaps more than any other single reform we could do. So more could be said both about the nature of the problem and also about reforms that could be adopted. I tend to believe that reforms should run along parallel tracks that involve both legal action and also political organization. I think that's what the lessons of history show, that successful reform movements do both. But I'm happy to talk in more detail about how to do that in questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sunny afternoon, which is awesome. So I work for an organization called Develop Detroit. We're a mission-based nonprofit real estate developer based in Detroit, Michigan, as you could guess with the name. We were conceptualized about 6 years ago by a group called the Housing Partnership Network. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this organization, but they're out of Boston. They've been operating for about 30 years. It's a national collaborative of affordable housing organizations, developers, financiers, service organizations, and over the last 15 years or so, they've refined their business strategy and their model to sort of serve as a venture philanthropist. And so what they do is go to different geographies, different markets, and assess those market needs, and then creatively develop social enterprises that address those needs. So in Detroit, 6 years ago, HPN alongside city leadership and other key stakeholders started having meetings in Detroit and assessing the landscape, and what they determined over the course of several months of due diligence was that there was a real need for a nonprofit developer that was well capitalized, that was high capacity, to be able to work in some of the transitional neighborhoods outside of the sliver of downtown Detroit that's been receiving a lot of the investment that Dan Gilbert and others have spurred. So we were launched officially 4 years ago after that initial due diligence and incubation sort of process and period. And we were created for three main things. When they took a look at the landscape in Detroit, what they saw was obviously, again, development happening in the core business district, particularly downtown, and the fact that those developments were not being inclusive and they were not equitable to a range of residents, but instead were only benefiting folks at the top of the income range, income spectrum. The other thing that they noticed and gathered through research was that in the neighborhoods there were a number of existing affordable housing apartment communities that were pretty close to being at the end of their compliance period. And what was happening in Detroit and other urban areas is that once those tax credit projects and developments, apartments are up for potential conversion to market rate, in a city like Detroit that's strengthening, what was happening is for-profit developers were buying those, acquiring those properties, and then turning them into market rate apartments, kicking out all the residents that were living there, displacing them so that they could increase rent. So that was another reason why Develop Detroit was launched. And then the other reason was that those communities were really, the apartment buildings themselves were poor quality. There were no services, no amenities that were being offered to the residents, no supports. And so our organization takes that, that's a core part of our business strategy, is to be able to enrich services at these apartment communities. And so those three things together were sort of the rationale behind our launch 4 years ago. In terms of legal tools, and I actually, there's a number of projects that we're working on now that I can speak to. But in the North End, is anyone familiar with the North End in Detroit, New Center North End? So that is a project that we've been working on for the last 3 years, really 4 years now, that we think best illustrates how you can develop equitably in the city. We acquired an apartment building on the corner of Woodward and Marston about 3 years ago. It's a 53 unit. It was a NOAA property, which stands for Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing. So there were no income restrictions per se, but those one bedrooms were being rented for something like $350, $400 a month. The owner, after the Q line and some other developments that were further south started coming online, that particular owner decided to list that community for sale, and he listed it in the materials as an opportunity for a for-profit developer. He was very direct about it, actually. It was an opportunity for a for-profit developer to come in, purchase to acquire the building. What he had done is actually rented out one of the bedrooms on the top floor. He called it a penthouse. He put some laminate and some vinyl and some granite, and he was able to get $850 for that unit. So his articulation of the value proposition of that particular property was, this is an opportunity for you to come in, kick everyone out, increase rents from $350, $400 a month to $800 a month, and obviously generate profit. So Develop Detroit, that we were launched for this very purpose. So we acquired that building so that we could keep those residents in place. We've already started the process of layering into that building some resources. So we're hiring a resident services coordinator to be able to not just offer folks a place to live, but to really give them some support and some amenities, and so things like gardening, raised bed gardens that are going to be surrounding the property. We're working with a number of service organizations to be able to help with financial literacy and other opportunities as we start to engage the community a little bit more and figure out what their needs and their desires are. In that same community, we're actually building a 12-unit market rate apartment building, and so and also single-family homes that are selling for between $160,000 up to $260,000. And so the reason why we've been really excited about this project is because it gives us a chance to sort of deploy all of our neighborhood development tools while allowing us to preserve affordability and bring in new neighbors to the community. So for us, it allows us a chance to build a community that is economically diverse, that's racially diverse, that gives individuals an opportunity to be homeowners. And so that's an illustration of the sort of work that we do. We're also developing projects in Eastern Market, Lafayette Park, if you're familiar with that neighborhood, Midtown, and then also Grandmont, Rosedale in the Detroit, on the west side of Detroit. So that's a really, I tried to make that really quick because I know that we've got some other topics and questions that we want to cover, but hopefully I get a chance to talk through a little bit more of our projects, the way that we raise capital, and I'll talk a little bit more about our execution of our mission.
Thank you all. So a few of you mentioned blight, and on this question of what is renewal, what is revitalization, when is it appropriate, maybe you might say to someone, okay, if a property is decrepit, if it's unsafe, if it's torn down, if it might fall under the idea of what we say or what we think when we say blight, then that's okay. And in particular, the City Council is considering a proposal to raise money through bonds to continue demolishing quote-unquote blighted homes. So I'm wondering your thoughts on whether that's right. Is it right that because something is blight, the answer is that it does need to get torn down? And maybe, council member, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So actually, as I sit here, I get all these text messages from the mayor's office because they really want me to vote in support of this, about what else they can do for me. So, so it's not an easy question, right? I mean, I represent downtown where tons of development, and I represent some of the highest concentrations of blight, meaning abandoned, empty houses in the entire city of Detroit. And so there's no easy solution to that. What we are considering or would like to see changed in the proposal being sent to City Council, the initial proposal that came from the mayor's office was just like, hey, let's issue public bonds to be able to get funding to accelerate the speed that we demolish property in the city of Detroit and demolish all the remaining structures within the next 5 years versus the next 13 years, which is what it would take us if we didn't actually issue these bonds, because we no longer have funding from the federal government to be able to do that. So we would like conditions attached to that. And so some of the conditions that we are fighting for to try to make it more equitable is that there is more of a focus on preservation, because I think oftentimes we think, oh, this house is ugly, it's open, it's dangerous. People, the motivation often comes from a place of fear and scarcity and like deprivation. Like, well, there's nothing here, look at all these empty houses. We would love this senior citizen to feel safe. Yes, I think we want everyone to feel safe and to live in clean and healthy neighborhoods, but simply removing a house doesn't necessarily create that. You need more than just this tool to get rid of abandoned structures. And the other piece I think that's missing from the conversation is what happens then with that land afterwards, right? So for us, we are hoping to see amendments to the resolution that speak to preserving public space, and maybe like a certain percentage of the land is like kept in city ownership to ensure that we have access to public space for people. I'm a big advocate of leasing versus just selling things outright to developers. That obviously is in conflict with some of the financial structures and how developers try to get funding for their projects. But I would, from cities we've seen from Copenhagen to Berlin, that's a more effective strategy versus outright selling the property. As it relates to demolishing specifically, we would like to see an actual boarding up, like preserve ideally every single structure, if you can actually board it up, then doing an actual assessment to determine what costs would be and what the conditions are of the house, and then to create a system that prioritizes Detroiters having access to the vacant land as well as property, whether that's through a discount program, through a priority bidding process, whatever it is. And then at the same time, if there truly is a structure that's like termite infested, that there's, you can't save the foundation, the roof, whatever it is, that there's a process then to demolish those. And that's a different approach than demolish and then save, and there's some pushback there, I will say. So the other piece we're looking at, and I know in some of the articles here, foreclosure prevention, right? So there's a reason that there's a certain number of houses that are blighted. Some have been vacant for like 15 plus years, and others more recently. And so there has to be a conversation and concerted effort as well that speaks to and looks at foreclosure prevention. And that's not just because people fall behind on property taxes, but the housing market in the city of Detroit is very old, and so people need support to be able to do home repairs. But a lot of folks are seniors, and a lot of folks live in poverty, don't necessarily have the resources. So people make the decision of like repairing their roof versus paying their property taxes, or paying their water versus paying their property taxes, and then find themselves on the foreclosure list. So there has to be a larger conversation around that. So I guess in short, we can't just talk about blight removal and demolition in isolation without having other plans in place to ensure that, again, the most marginalized will actually see some type of benefit, and that they have access to be able to purchase some of this property, but there's also public spaces that is protected as a means of that as well. And that some of the efforts we see in neighborhoods that are being revitalized, that resources also go towards recreation and towards public transportation and towards like buffering to improve air quality, and investing in small businesses. Like, you can't just have blight removal and expect the city to turn around, because then you just have this vacant, like, I guess, swaths of land, and just, developers will come in or speculators will come in. That, again, there needs to be a balance of other protection and investment in other things that make the quality of life for folks in the city of Detroit good, so to speak.
Thank you. I think, Professor Somin, did you have something, and then Olga?
Yes.
Great.
So blight is something I've written about quite a lot in my academic career. I think there's some easy, low-hanging fruit in the issue of blight, such as eliminating those laws which still exist in many states, most notoriously in New York State, where it's still the case that almost any area can be declared blighted and then condemned and transferred even to private interests. I think there's every reason to abolish that. But I would go further and say even in the areas where it is genuinely blighted, like an ordinary person would look at this place and say, yes, this is blighted, it's dilapidated. You don't have to be a lawyer to come up with some convoluted, weird definition of blight to say that this place is blighted. Still, I would say that in most cases, destroying the neighborhood in order to save it is not the right way to go. Usually actually allowing the people who live there and investors and the like to have secure property rights will actually promote the thing which can most improve the quality of buildings over time, which is economic growth and development, rather than sort of condemnation and destruction. I think there can be problems associated with blight, which do call for some regulation, particularly ones where there's a risk to public health and the like there's a spread of disease or something. But the way to deal with that is, I think, more with a scalpel approach and with a meat cleaver, have specific targeted restrictions. You have to bring in the exterminator to get rid of the diseased rats periodically, that kind of thing, rather than, wiping the neighborhood out and destroying it. There is different problems arise in places where it's not that people are currently living in the house or the building, but that it's been abandoned. I think actually the better way to go in most cases is in fact to try to, as soon as you can, privatize it to new private owners over time with proper incentives. Those owners are likely to do a better job of finding the best uses for the property and developing it than bureaucrats will do, or with due respect even elected officials, because in general you have better incentives to use land effectively if you own it yourself than if you're making decisions about other people's land or taxpayer-owned land. If it's the case that nobody wants the property, then that may point to a deeper problem with the city's or the state's economic policy that should be addressed at a sort of more macro level, like maybe, as we've been discussing in this symposium, maybe the property taxes are unrealistic, the assessments are too high, maybe there's a bad regulatory environment, maybe there's other problems going on, but usually the better solution or the better approach to these situations is not either to condemn and destroy places, or for the city itself or for the state government to go into business of being a big landowner or a landlord or whatever, is to enable homeowners and investors to have strong, secure property rights and create a good environment for that stimulates growth over time.
Okay, well, let me give a contrasting opinion to that. I think we're talking about two different issues. So first I want to separate them, and I think you mentioned that. There is the term blight, which applies in the public mind to the entire city of Camden and probably 90% of the city of Detroit. And I've spent, in all my redevelopment cases, I have actually litigated that these communities that are everybody's idea of blight are really not blighted. Because I think the harm that comes with that blight designation, the incredible powers of local officials to then seize that land whenever they feel like it for the next 25 years and have the homeowners live with the idea that their home is no longer their home. They may have it taken from them next year, they may have it taken from them 5 years from now. That's a very cruel thing to do to a community. So I think we use the legal tools we have as lawyers to try to finagle our way through those definitions of blight and try to show that there are real assets in the neighborhood, that there are homeowners who actually do take care of their homes, whose homes are beautiful when you go inside them, even if they look like in a neighborhood that a bomb dropped on. So those are the occupied homes. With the abandoned homes, I think you have a totally different issue. I think city officials actually are sort of in a pickle of what to do with them, because they can be health hazards. People can have bricks fly off of them. They can have, they can be used for illegal activities, for squatting. They can have fires start in them. They are a hazard on the neighborhood. But at the same time, like Camden, like Detroit, kind of went demolition happy and just got all this extra money from the state and just started tearing down buildings, and now neighborhoods really look like they were bombed out. You know, like you have one little house, one little row house, and it looks beautiful, and it has little flower boxes, and it's freshly painted, and all around are abandoned, trash-ridden, overgrown weeds and lots. And it's kind of like heartbreaking to look at. The problem with abandoned houses is in an economy like Camden, it might cost $150,000 to repair this home, and at the end of that process, the home is going to be worth $60,000. And I don't believe that the private market can take care of that problem. I don't believe investors or speculators or hedge funds or people who buy up properties and foreclosures, that they have any good intentions with those properties. And for the ordinary low-income person who might want to live in that house, they don't have the $150,000 to fix it up. No one's going to give them that kind of money for a home that's not worth it at the end. And, you know, how do you translate that abandoned home that could be fixed up into a home for someone that really needs it? In Camden, the best working model for that is small, local, community-based nonprofit organizations that do inventories of the houses in their community, figure out which ones are the ones that make the most sense to rehab and preserve, and then try to scrounge together subsidies and government funding and state funding from every place they can so that they have enough money to fix up the house and then sell it at an affordable price to a homeowner. But that takes a lot of political will, and it takes the subsidy money. And you know, we right now are not generous with our funding, especially for fixing up, you know, homes in communities like Camden and transferring them to low-income homeowners. So those nonprofits do a fabulous job, but they do it on an extremely limited budget, and, you know, they can't keep up. Like, there are more homes coming abandoned every year than they can possibly fix up and transfer to home ownership. So I think there has to be a political will to recognize this as more of a priority and fund it at a much higher rate than what's happening now.
Thank you. So
If I may really quickly just add, to that end, as an urban planner, thinking about eminent domain, thinking about highest and best use, I think that funding that sort of creation and preservation that we've heard about is the highest and best use of what is the $250 million bond that's being proposed. Creation along with demolition, preservation along with demolition, assessment that saves the homes of people in those communities, that restores the lost commons these communities have suffered due to decades of disinvestment, should be rolled into whatever the plan is for demolition. It's not to say demolition is unnecessary. There are longtime homeowners on these streets where they're the only house who do want to see some of the homes removed because they are a danger to their children, because there are things going on in those homes that they don't want to see, because the house itself is an environmental hazard. However, we can't just destroy without building, especially in Detroit, where we have the highest rent increase in the country for a city of our size over the last few years, where affordable housing is hard to find, where naturally occurring affordable housing is even harder to find, where we're set to lose over 10,000 of our subsidized units in the next few years. We cannot think that tearing down homes where no one lives is actually going to benefit the residents that currently are in homes that they're going to lose soon, or that are in homes that are seeing rents increase. Also, stemming the pipeline of blight is important, and that's something that isn't contemplated in this bond, is that we are still creating blight. Blight is a cycle that we have seen that is robustly fed by the unconstitutional tax foreclosure system. We take homes, we put them in the land bank. If a speculator doesn't find them viable or valuable, they sit and they become blight. And so we remove people from their homes, hoping that it will become a profitable investment for someone outside of the city or some newcomer into the city, and if it's not, it becomes blight. And then we use the tax dollars from the residents that are here to say, now we have to fix that problem by tearing that home down rather than renovating that home so that we can put a family back in it or restore the family that lost it to the foreclosure crisis in the first place. So I think that it's not innovative enough thinking. I think that we hear a lot about how Detroit's property and land use and real estate market is so unique and so different from other places, but I don't see solutions being proposed that are innovative and unique. I see the same old propositions that were, the major problem for Negro removal back in the day, is that it's a problem, let's get rid of it, let's fund the people who created the problem, and it's what I like to call wish upon a star economics. That if we let the people who created the problem come up with a solution, hopefully, maybe this time they're thinking and then their motivations will be different. So that's my perspective.
So
Can I actually quickly respond to that?
Yeah,
So is it Olga? So in response to what she said, we're actually one of those nonprofits who are really fortunate to be well funded. Some of our funding partners, Kresge Foundation, Ford Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and a few others. And so in the North End, the neighborhood that I...
Not exactly inspiring names.
Yeah, no, I know, but the good thing is that a lot of the issues surround capital, right? And to Olga's point earlier, our nonprofit has received grant subsidies from the city, from foundations and others, to be able to execute on this sort of work. So in the North End, where I mentioned the 53-unit affordable property that we acquired and that we're in the process of beginning to rehabilitate, we also started on 21 homes. 7 of those are new construction and 14 of those are rehabs. And so for many of those homes, they sat vacant for over 15 years. We took some capital. We have a single family team on our organization who runs this effort, because it really does take a lot of coordination and effort. I mean, even 14 rehabbed homes, probably 2 years to conceptualize and to assess and to figure out where you get the capital from, which contractors, which is another sometimes a challenge in Detroit, to find contractors who know how to do historic rehabs, who stay on budget, stay on time. But we were able to rehabilitate those homes. We've sold half of them. We've got the other half listed last week. And so we think that nonprofits certainly have to be a part of that. There are other community development organizations in the city that do really, really strong work. CDC is one of them, JEI on the Jefferson corridor. But one of the challenges there, again, is scale. We, for 2 years, conceptualizing this site plan for 21 homes, there are many other homes in the North End that we hope to help those particular streets and blocks that have been impacted by blight. But it's a really challenging effort. The other quick thing that I'll add to that is capital. The way that lenders and investors view blight really does dictate the sorts of projects that developers can execute on. And so we actually weren't even able to start rehabilitating the 53-unit apartment building in the North End until MISHDA, the Michigan State Housing Authority, was comfortable with our blight remediation plan. And so the difficulty there is we have a building that we'd like to rehabilitate, to add services to help the residents that are living there. We can't do that because surrounding it and on that block and others adjacent to it have 25 to 30 homes that are blighted, and it's sort of this like circular perpetuating challenge around how do you communicate to funders in a way, lenders, investors particularly, in a way that sees capital flowing to some of these neighborhoods to do the sort of work that we're talking about.
Everyone wants to comment on that one. And I think that's just really important to highlight, right? Because I don't control the financial market or stock market. And so it's hard because it's all based on perception. So I think we forget often about what is institutionalized from colonial times and the perception of who is worthy to own property and who has access. And so when we're talking about blight bonds specifically now, the conversation often comes up, well, like, who's going to want to invest $80,000 in a house if you're not going to get a return on your investment? And I'm like, my sister's who makes like $45,000, who's a teacher, and this is all that she can afford, and she wants to be in this community. But that's like a foreign concept to people. Like, why would someone want to move into a street that has like 15 blighted properties? One, because that's probably the only place that you can afford, and two, you're looking to seek the American dream and to fulfill that for your family and to create stability. We see this oftentimes from immigrant communities, right? Like fleeing other countries. But it is so hard. Myself, I'm on city council, I've been elected. It took like 3 years to try to qualify for a mortgage because my debt to income ratio was like too high, student loans, guys. But then also too, it wasn't, why do I want to invest in that community, which wasn't seen as being viable, and it took forever to do the appraisal because there was no comparable like properties. So the financial institutions honestly like help perpetuate this problem, because we think of homeowners and we think of middle class homeowners. We don't necessarily want poor people to own property because they're not responsible. Why do we want those folks owning property? And so I think the underlying perceptions of fear that who runs financial institutions tend to be older white men that are then become racialized play out, that we don't have enough conversations about, but that sometimes then are outside the role of government, maybe at least at the local level, maybe federally there's more of an impact, that then complicates the problem of like how do you remove empty structures and promote home ownership amongst low-income communities in ways when there's not necessarily the financial capital to do that. Yeah, it's not an easy answer.
You can see that this panel does not need me. So.
Sure. I apologize for usurping the powers of the moderator, so I'll try to be brief. I just want to comment on two things. One is I would want to question a little bit the notion that the private sector can't build affordable housing without extensive subsidies. We have a long and extensive history in this country of it doing just that, going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, ironically, eminent domain and restrictive zoning, the tools we were talking about earlier, were in fact they in fact spread as a way of preventing that so much affordable housing was being created in different places that people, the poor, minorities were moving in where others did not want them to be. And so eminent domain and zoning were used to prevent that from happening. And today, if you look in areas where there isn't as much restrictive zoning, there is actually a lot of affordable housing being built, even in places experiencing booms in migration, like Houston, Atlanta, the place in the South and the Southwest. I think that also shows that you don't need big subsidies to build these sorts of housing, so long as you don't put up excruciating regulatory obstacles to that construction. Amina, I think it was said that we don't want to empower the very people who created the problem in the first place. I think there's a lot to that, though obviously there's a lot of people who actually bear responsibility in various ways. But one of the big things that I think caused these problems to begin with is the mindset that instead of letting people build housing and move around freely, we're instead going to have a sort of central planning mentality where government officials, bureaucrats, planners know better who should live where, in what kind of housing, and so forth. And that's how we got urban renewal and the massive forcible displacement of people. It's how we got the severely restrictive zoning, where many millions of people are not able to move to where they could otherwise find better housing and opportunities. So it seems to me that we want to avoid empowering those kinds of centralized organizations and those kinds of planners and officials who their predecessors in earlier years were at least a big part of how we got into our current unfortunate situation.
Well, my perspective is that the private market isn't going to meet the needs of affordable housing because our legal system isn't premised on housing being a fundamental human right or being recognized as a need. Our entire legal system is based on valuing the right to make money off of housing, the right to invest, to collect a profit, to gain, to financially benefit from a housing shortage by jacking up rents and jacking up prices. That's what our legal foundation is built on. So unless we really recognize that housing is a right, and to make sure that we protect everyone's right to shelter and have a whole body of law centered around that right, instead, we make sure that the investors get their profit, that the people who bought up the tax bonds, that they collect their 18% interest, that the landlord isn't hampered by rent control, and if there is a housing shortage, they can jack up the rents to something unaffordable. When incomes go up slightly, so do the rents, because landlords realize, oh my goodness, people will pay even more for rent, so why don't I charge more? But we're reluctant to institute rent control or regulations or force inclusionary zoning that would require that housing be made available to everybody in a community. all our discussions in the symposium show how we don't have adequate laws to protect against displacement in multiple forms. So I think as long as the legal system protects the landlords, the investors, the developers, and not the people who need the housing, the private market isn't going to serve it.
So I think that's a really great range of both ideas on how we got to where we are and also what are the tools that are available, which ones are working, which ones are not, for what reasons. We would love to open it up for questions if folks have them. They do. Wow, amazing. Mary Kate or Nathan will come around with a microphone, and for you all, to the extent that it's relevant to the answers to questions, the strategies for reform or moving forward that you think are or are not working well and what we should be pursuing, I think we'd love to hear about those too.
I would like to hear from Amina and Councilwoman Castañeda-López about what your insights are about the land bank. You mentioned the land bank. I think it's kind of an elephant in the room in terms of contribution to the problem, but also lack of opportunity or missed opportunity for how we could be solving some of the dispossession and coupling people in place together again. And then also if you could speak about other issues that make a home uninhabitable other than its physical structure, like lack of access to utilities and things like that, where we choose to make them basically uninhabitable by disconnecting.
So I think the land bank is absolutely a missed opportunity, but also the recognition that the land bank in its creation and its structure was contemplated to operate exactly how it's operating. So it is achieving all of its goals. And I absolutely think that the land bank, I mean, we talk about the blight problem. Well, the land bank is, for all intents and purposes, an institutional body created by the government as a shell company for speculators. So it holds the... Oh, sorry. So the land bank receives properties that go up for foreclosure, and it bundles them, and you can buy them on auction. So the land bank holds public properties for the city of Detroit, but it is not a government entity. It has its own private board. It doesn't operate by the rules and regulations. It doesn't have to get clearance for most of what it does, and then it auctions off these properties for a profit. It is a weird entity. It's not transparent, so it's hard to get information out of them about anything, about what properties they hold, about how much money they have, about how they disseminate and disperse properties. So you'll see properties come out of the land bank for deals, for developers, large deals. We'll magically have parcels that are given as part of the city's offering that come out of the land bank. There's also a large auction website that sells properties out of the land bank. So a lot of them are the homes that are lost on the foreclosure auction that people once lived in. And so they are then used as bargaining chips in deals that are happening around the city. I think the land bank is a huge missed opportunity because the properties are vacant and could be revitalized and preserved and given, for sometimes they're part of the demolitions. Homes on land bank are raised and then there's empty lots. There is a lot of innovation and a lot of opportunity around the city of Detroit for citizens, longtime citizens that have lived there, and the land bank could support some of those nonprofits, some of those individuals that have ideas and lack the land and lack the capital, but those properties do not go to regular citizens, they go to large deals. I think it has a lot to do with what Councilperson Lopez spoke about, which is stewards of land. Who is an appropriate steward? Who is seen as valuable? Who should have control? Who's worthy of control? Who's worthy of the power that comes with owning land? And those decisions are made, as I said, by this closed body that interacts with the city in a very particular way to make determinations of who should have what land in what spaces. I forget your second question. Okay, so I think that actually you spoke a lot to housing as a human right, which is something that I advocate for. We don't think of land and property and housing as being a right, as something people have a right to, and I think decent housing is part of that imagining. If you think housing is a human right, then naturally you think that decent housing is a human right, not substandard, which means you don't cut off water, you don't allow people to squat because they've lost their home to foreclosure and the house is sitting vacant and now they're living in it with all the utilities shut off. And so when you understand that people deserve housing and it is a human right, then those sorts of policy decisions don't even cross your mind, to shut off someone's water, to close the schools in that area so the children have no educational options. And so I think it's tied to the way we think, once again, of land, how we contemplate land.
Put my 2-minute timer on. So really quickly, in terms of land bank, I would say to their credit, although it's an authority, a lot of the direction comes from the administration. So the land bank doesn't set land use policies. The planning department does within the city of Detroit. And I think just to clarify, all public-owned land, there used to be a real estate division under the planning department and under emergency management that essentially was taken away, and the authority was established in different ways. And so all publicly owned land was transferred, residential was transferred to the land bank, and then as properties have come from foreclosure or other ways, I don't know, because sometimes people just give property to the land bank, then that is also in the land bank. So it's more than just foreclosed properties. That's why there's so many parcels, in all honesty. But I mean, for me, the land bank, it's city property that they are maintaining, essentially. So when people attack the land bank, I'm like, I feel like we should also be responsible because we're the city, essentially, that funds their budget. So for me, in that regard, it's one and the same, and that a lot of times people focus on the land bank, and I'm like, no, you should also be focusing on the mayor's office and on city council and what's happening, because it's not just the land bank in of itself, and they take a lot of direction from the mayor's office. So that said, I will say that and having just met with them yesterday again to talk about these demolition bonds, I think in some regards, in some of the programs, they've been great. So like side lots, for example, that they sell for $100, the vast majority of those have gone to residents who have been maintaining that land for like years, and that's really amazing. I didn't even know this stat, I thought it was lower, but the statistics in terms of, I can't remember exactly which program, but another program that they sell property through, 70% of those go to residents in the city of Detroit, or have been purchased by residents in the city of Detroit, which is way higher than I had thought it was. Now, there are definitely other challenges in that. I think 3 main pieces is, one, they don't have other land disposition policies or programs really besides the side lot and then selling it online through an Own It Now, where it's essentially is just gutted and you rehabbed it, or rehabbed and ready, and then that's it. So if you have a lot, we get this a lot, if there's a side lot, my time, 2 minutes already passed. If you own a side lot that's like too big, you can't buy it. If you own a side lot, if you want to buy a side lot that's in a improperly zoned area, you can't buy it. So there's a lot of like flaws with the program as well. And then the other piece, to complement what Amina was saying, is that the land bank also holds property in certain areas zoned like public center, arena, or whatever it is, and it's not really clear how you buy those. There's no clear path, and then if folks are they finally figure out how, then it's at like, okay, $12,000 for this lot, because that's quote unquote market rate. One, I'm always like, who the heck is the market? And they're like, the market, Raquel. I'm like, no, who's the market? I think I'm the market, and the rest of the people that live here are the market. So defining and pushing back about what the market means. And then 2, this assumption that you can buy a side lot for $100 if it meets all the other requirements, but if it doesn't, then you have to pay market rate. And when we've pushed back on it, it's like, well, we don't know if people are really going to be responsible for maintaining that property, so we need them to pay market rate. And I'm like, how the heck does market rate actually determine that you are responsible for maintaining that property? So there's different tensions. My saying that the city plays a role is because I think we should also be held accountable, and it's not just like yelling at the land bank board, because ultimately we sustain the authority through the funding we give them. Otherwise, they couldn't operate based on the sales that they actually do. And I mean, I think Amina did a great job of talking about the other reasons that homes go into foreclosure. A lot of it is really because people are trying to maintain decent housing through roof repairs, through plumbing repairs, through paying water bills and other utilities to prevent that from being shut off. And I was on a panel just yesterday with the wonderful Monica Lewis-Patrick talking about this, and this happens all the time, that if your water gets shut off, then you go to your sister's house or your grandmother's house or whoever's house, and then that places an additional financial burden on another person that was already struggling to maintain their utility bills as is, and then they have another like 4 or 5 people to try to support and absorb. So you see this kind of like communal support of folks, but also you abandon a house because you can't afford the water bill. And then I just learned this in the state of Michigan, if you don't have water or lights on, CPS, Child Protective Services, can take your kids away within 72 hours, right? So if a mom can't have water on, they don't want their children to be taken away, they move someplace else where they do have access to water, and then there's that burden is transferred to another household, and that house is left abandoned. So I think those are other more complex ways that we don't really talk about as to why homes end up abandoned and in foreclosure.
Thank you all. So we're going to try something fun and take 3 questions, and then let everyone sort of answer them as you will.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name's Cosmo. I'm a 1L here at the law school right now, and I was an activist in Detroit for a few years. And, you know, in thinking through all these things, it's like I think that Amina's observation is really astute, and that, like, you know, in the legacy or in the shadow of colonialism and racism, like, obviously the land bank is working just as it's supposed to, but on the other hand, you have just total unrestrained lawlessness and corruption at basically every level of the city administration. So what are the hopes for a tide shift, you know, and wresting control of the city from this kind of corporate, anti-democratic, totally unaccountable governance? I mean, the mayor's office alone is under, I don't know how many different federal investigations. And, you know, this is just such a huge piece of the puzzle missing, you know. I mean, when you talk about the demolitions, there's the fact that, you know, they're using tainted highway soils to fill the basements and all these, totally no regard for, you know, demolition procedures and all of this. So I mean, what are the hopes of changing that? I mean, short of prosecuting the mayor, or I mean, you know, do you think that'll happen?
Thank you. Who's got the
Yeah, this is a question of common components, so you guys can take it how you want. But I would say, just like you were talking about unpacking the terms of renewal and et cetera, I would say let's unpack what we mean when we say the private market, right? Because, I mean, I know what Ilya is saying about affordable housing, and I know how he gets there with the data, but I would also say that you could make a much more compelling argument that over the last century, the private market has never been able to produce housing at the level that's affordable and of quality that we need. And I think there's a bit of scholarship that would prove that. Number 2, I would say that if we want to consider what the private market is and what it does, saying what's happening in neighborhoods in Detroit and what we call blight is not something that's often the responsibility of individuals, but we can actually look at the corporations and companies that are benefiting and making those actions happen in those places. And the reason that's important, and I think I'll get to the last one, and Ilya is familiar with this, but we can talk about Proposal 4 in Michigan, right? So after Kilo, there's this huge idea that there's some epidemic of public takings in the US, which, you know, depending on how you want to define epidemic, you might be able to get there, but there really isn't. But there's a mass movement, and Ilya's written about this, across the United States to pass proposals to limit the power of eminent domain. And most of them didn't. I think that was your own conclusion in 2009. So most of them don't do that. But what does it do in Detroit? It does 2 things. And if you talk to libertarian attorneys here, you talk to the Castle Coalition, you talk to any other people about that, they'll say, look, Detroit can still use eminent domain in cases of blight, and they could consolidate property and transfer it to private companies, even if all of the properties in there weren't blighted. You could make they even say you could make an argument that way. But the second thing that it does is it guarantees that the city pays 125% of market value to everyone that owns property when they use eminent domain. So what that means is not you as an individual. Sure, it takes care of like the few studies we have out there that show that low-income individuals get paid less and high-income individuals get paid more. It takes care of that, but what you're actually doing is paying off large-scale speculators that have been holding their property and allowing it to be blighted or acting as slumlords over years at a higher rate than they should be able to get. So the exact conditions that we're saying create these situations are responded to in the law by limiting the power of the state. And the reason that it's a problem to limit the power of the state is that's the only place in which those same residents have at least some agency to act and talk to those that are in power and to try and influence that situation. By taking that power away and then guarantee that speculators get more money for holding it, we actually encourage and create more of those conditions of blight. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And one more?
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to hear from all of you, and I feel lucky because I think my question follows from both of the previous comments. I think we're talking a lot about policy and rights, and specifically the right to affordable housing, and everyone is bringing up economics, but I'm really curious about your idea of economic policy. I was really appreciative, Representative Castañeda-López, that you brought up the settler colonial history related to this, because I see this history flowing into capitalism, which we're living with today. So my question is, what do you see, what do you see as the role of economic policy changes or economic human rights in solving this? Because it seems like that's an important thing to address. Thanks.
So I got, what do we do with government? What is the private market? And what do we do along the lines of economic and policy changes? Clearly you haven't needed me to facilitate yet, and I don't think you do now, so whoever wants to take a stab can totally do so. Sure.
So I think question number 2 was at least in large part directed at me, so I'll take a stab at it. Though I'll mention something briefly about question number 3 about human rights. I think one human right that can be very valuable to addressing these sorts of issues is the right to private property, both the right not to be kicked out of land that you own, but also the right to build new housing and other structures on property you own, which can in turn facilitate the construction of affordable housing for a wider range of people and also facilitate economic development as well. And that leads actually into question number 2, which I think was more directed at me. Obviously, in the next minute or two, we're not going to be able to settle the last 100 or 150 years of history of the U.S. and of the world, but I think if you look at that history, you will find that one reason why the U.S. became close to the wealthiest nation in the world and went from a population of something like 80 or 90 million in the late 19th century to over 300 million today, while simultaneously increasing the standard of living, is in fact because the private market, when allowed to do so, did provide an enormous amount of pretty good housing to a large number of people. The problem we've had in the last 50 or 60 years is that we have, in many parts of the country, severely limited that in some of the ways that I've mentioned earlier. You said, well, if people can't use the power of the state, what agency do they have? Often the agency they have is through owning or renting property, which can empower them in many different ways. Another agency is the agency of mobility. Absent zoning restrictions, they could move to places which have better government, better job opportunities, and so forth, but those restrictions prevent millions of people from doing so, including people who, in political structures, for a variety of reasons, usually do not have much leverage when the state is actually in control of a lot of things. On the post-Kelo reforms, I appreciate your citing my work on that. I did say that a lot of them didn't accomplish very much. On the other hand, there were about 20 states, including the state of Michigan, which have provided significantly increased protection compared to what existed before. Increased protection is not the same thing as what I at least would consider ideal protection. In Michigan, they have limited blight condemnations to situations where it seems like it's at least somewhat genuinely blighted in the layperson's sense of the word, but I would go further in that and I would severely restrict even where it is blighted. And you make a good point that it still allows some condemnation of non-blighted properties if the area around it can be declared blighted. I think that's problematic. On the issue of compensation, I do think that eminent domain compensation should be higher than market value, even when it's owned by speculators and others, because much of the time when people are holding property and not selling it at market value, that's a sign that they themselves actually value it at more than whatever the market value calculation is. So if you compensate them only at the market value, don't compensate them fully. At the same time, I totally recognize that it's very difficult to find the right compensation formula. That's something actually I read about at length in my book. One of the reasons why I want to limit the use of eminent domain to as narrow a range of circumstances as possible is because it actually is extremely difficult to find the right compensation formula. So any formula that adequately compensates people will end up also overcompensating some, including perhaps some of the speculators you're talking about. One of the many things that government planners are not very good at doing is figuring out good compensation amounts for eminent domain. So I say that's a further argument for not condemning property as often as we currently do.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the questions.
Other thoughts? I can repeat the questions. What do we do about Detroit's government? What is, in fact, the private market? And what are, maybe in particular, economic policy changes that might have a place in this issue?
I can speak in regard to Detroit's government. I think that we have a massive problem with political will in Detroit, and we have too closely intertwined of a relationship between public and private, in that private has been able to elevate its interest as the public interest. And we have government officials that have accepted that and are using policy and legal tools to create a system that prioritizes the needs of the private sector over the needs of residents. And then after those decisions are made behind closed doors, take those decisions to residents and say, we made them in your best interest. You are just too uneducated and too poor to understand that this is in your best interest. I think that the best way to rectify that is a seat change, a massive seat change, so that those impacted residents who have been, getting the short end of the stick for decades become those elected officials because they are plugged in. They don't have to go and try to create a community outreach or community engagement new structure, because they are the community, they are engaged in the community, they have those relationships, they know how to reach the people that they represent. And I think that organizing is the tool to that. I think that the impacted residents of Detroit have to be organized so that those residents can be elevated into elected officials, because right now we do not have the pipeline of low-income impacted residents of color who are able to run for those offices because they don't have the funding and they don't have the knowledge of exactly how to run a campaign. And so really there needs to be some support structures implemented in order to get new elected officials into place, because I agree that with the current administration, there just isn't any political will to achieve any of the kind of innovative, forward-thinking, progressive policies that we need in order to see even a vague form of the current Detroit decades down the line. That's not the vision, and that's not what any of the activities right now are trying to achieve. And if nothing is done, we will not see the Detroit of today or any remnants of it in the future. In regard to the economic policy changes, very, very strong in Detroit is structural spatial racism, and it's been baked into our policies and baked into our land use. It's baked into all of our current dreams of what the future of Detroit will be. And I think we need restructuring of an intervention, and that requires disruption. That requires disruption of the way land use and policy decisions around land and housing operate in Detroit, which means we cannot create and envision land use, affordable housing, or land and policy decisions in a way that is a win-win for everyone. The speculators and the developers cannot continue to make the windfall that they currently make in Detroit, and us also shift the way that power and land and housing operate so that they go to the most vulnerable residents. The most vulnerable residents' needs being addressed is in direct contradiction to the interest of those that hold the land, the power, and the money in Detroit. And we have to be willing to confront that and accept that and say, you're not going to win this one. As a matter of fact, you're going to lose. You're going to lose this one. You're going to lose some money. You're not going to get the sweetest deal that you wanted, because right now we're prioritizing other people. We do it all the time to the residents. We say, everyone can't win. Right now, Ford is going to win. Right now, the Illiches are going to win. Right now, the Pistons are going to win. We don't ever go the other way. And until we have elected officials that are willing to do that, and philanthropies that are willing to do that, because they have a very strong market hand in what happens in Detroit with land and housing, we're not going to see the kind of systems change that we need.
I really agree with most of those comments. I just want to add a few other thoughts. I think a key to changing every community is unique and has its own history and dynamics and politics. But I think a lot of the reason why we see sort of this kind of government not accountable is because citizens in a low-income area are struggling so much to survive. They may not know much about what's going on. They may not have the resources, the ability to learn about what's going on, and they may feel a sense of hopelessness of why even engage. So there are no funding, there is no funding, there is no allocation of resources and energy to real basic grassroots community organizing. It's usually done by volunteers who really don't have the time, energy, and resources to do it themselves, but they do it because they feel they have to. So I think that's a real missing piece. I know in a place like Camden, we have no paid organizers anywhere. I mean, we might have little neighborhood nonprofits that do a little bit of outreach and a little, neighborhood beautification, but we don't have anybody that would fund something that is a little more disruptive, that is a little more controversial, that isn't just like playing along by the playbook and doing what City Hall wants you to do so that you get the grants and you get the support when you need it. The other problem that I think city officials face, that I think is a real problem, that is, as a society, we don't have a collective belief that we are all better off if everyone has decent housing, that we are all better off if there aren't little neighborhoods out there that are in horrible condition, polluted and dangerous and unsafe, but because we don't see them and because they don't affect us personally, we don't worry about them. And we don't, in this society, have much of that kind of belief. If we, sometimes I think that maybe in an urban area, people are closer to each other, maybe they would develop more of that collective belief, but unfortunately in our society, I don't see it happening. I see people instead trying to set up barriers. And it hits people on a very personal level. It's not just investors and evil speculators and slumlords. There's some towns I work with which are proud and happy to be exclusive and racist. I mean, they won't say it exactly that way, but that's the message. We kept out those people. We have a nice community. We have good schools. We don't have to deal with all that. Then there are communities like, I'll use Asbury Park as an example. Asbury Park is what I call Brooklyn by the Sea. It's a little resort town in New Jersey coast full of musicians, artists, hipsters, a gay community. It prides itself on being diverse and inclusive, and they came to Asbury because Asbury is a very diverse community. It has a very large entrenched African American community there. So their property values are going to go up if Asbury Park Housing Authority is successful in demolishing all of its public housing, which is right there in downtown. So are these people who pride themselves on loving an inclusive community, are they going to come out to fight to save public housing, which is an eyesore to them, which contributes to this perception that Asbury is still dangerous and unsafe, and their own condo or their own house would rise in value? That's the kind of decisions that we force people to make. So I think that until we have a collective understanding of a common good, we can't really blame our city officials in a way, because they're doing what the larger part of the community wants them to do. They don't have the support of the larger community to keep them in office if they force their own citizenry to do something that's politically unpalatable and unpopular.
So I think we will have to call it with that, and we will leave you with that question of what are you going to do and what are we going to do? And luckily, that's the next thing that we're doing. So I encourage you, if you wanted to hear more from Sean or the council member who didn't get to speak right at the end, you can join their small group. But for now, please join me in thanking all of our panelists here.